What would a movie be without a soundtrack? I mean, they set the entire tone of the movie. You ever been to one without? Wait just a minute. I think we need to get out of the water. Are you a little bit scared right now? You see how that sets the tone. Maybe we need a little bit more hope. Do you have something that's a little bit more hopeful, Eddie? You have a picture of Judy Garland in your mind? You feel like there might be hope? Then there's always those movies that are romantic. We need those romantic scores. I can tell how old you are from the ones who are smiling and see Audrey Hepburn sitting on the fire escape. We also need some songs that might uplift us, and maybe we need some for the children as well. If you don't recognize that one, ask the kids. Unless you've got a friend from Toy Story. Thank you so much, Eddie, for helping. Do you see it? Do you see how music elicits and sets the mood? If we were to watch a movie with the sound down, and maybe you've done that from time to time, just had it in the background, it does not capture your attention. It is not the same. We also have soundtracks in our own lives. We have different moods that hit us, and maybe we play different music at different times. I'll never forget, some years ago, my friend Chris was in a hard place. His fiance had broken off the engagement, and he was depressed, and I was worried about him, so I went and knocked on the door, and he didn't even say anything, but I could hear music playing. And so I pushed the door open, and he was sitting in the dark, smoking a cigar, drinking something, I'm not sure what it was. And in the background was a song, "I'd Be Better Off in a Pine Box on a Slow Train Bound for Georgia." Now, if you've never heard that song, it is depressing. Chris was just sitting there quietly. Have you ever had those times when you just felt that life was pulling you down and you didn't know a way up? David was a person of music. Most of the Psalms were written by King David. They were written, many of them, when he was younger. But in this song, we find a time in a crisis in David's life when he feels as if he has been pulled down into a miry clay pit, one whose walls would not allow him to climb up and out. We all, at some point in our lives, will encounter difficulties. I remember early in my ministry feeling really down, and a deacon came along and said, "Pastor, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger." And I wanted to kill him. Because there are those times that we are just down in life. But I respected that fellow. He had something called gravitas. That certain weightiness to life. And I asked him, why did you say that? He said, because it's true. And then he began to share with me some of his times in life when he wasn't sure if he was going to make it, when everything seemed to be caving in on him. Those things that happen to us can make us stronger. Maybe you've seen the movie Gran Torino with Clint Eastwood playing a man named Walt. And Walt is a veteran, and Walt's wife is dying with cancer. And there's a young priest that comes and talks to Walt. And he tries to convince him that there is life everlasting. And he, at the funeral of his wife, says some flowery things. And Walt goes up to him after the funeral and he says, "You don't know anything about death." Well, he actually said a few more words. He said, You don't know anything about death. You don't understand it. You're too young. You haven't lived enough life. At the end of that movie, Walt gives his own life to protect some of his neighbors. And the priest gives a beautiful eulogy and says, I never knew anything about death until I met Walt, who taught me about those times in life that are heavy and weighty. You know those times if you've ever lost a job. You know those times if you've ever faced grief. Maybe you've lost a grandparent or a parent or a spouse, or God forbid, there are those here who have even lost children. It is times like these that challenge our faith. Times of suffering and depression can come upon us all. Times when we face illness and we know of our own finitude that our lives cannot go on forever. And then there are those times in life when we mess up, when we sin against God and each other. And that's one of those times that David is writing about. When he has sinned and he is afraid that God is not there, or that God has deserted him, that he is in this pit. He just cannot get back into life. You probably felt that way from time to time. And there's a hymn in our hymnal that we never sing. Come ye disconsolate, where'er you languish. We don't sing it. It's an old spiritual, but it's also one of those hymns that just sounds down. It is in those minor keys. But it also says, earth hath no sorrow that heaven cannot heal. You see, we come together this morning to worship God and to remember that we as a church laugh with those who laugh, and we rejoice together, and many times we are up, but we are also called to weep with those who are weeping. I read a Facebook post from my friend Bill, who's battling cancer. And he said something funny because he's too a pastor. He said, my faith didn't get me through this. And I thought, where are you going with this, Bill? We all talk about our faith getting us through something. But he said, my faith didn't get me through this. God's grace got me through it. He said, my faith was not strong enough, is not strong enough for this moment, but God's grace is sufficient for me. It is God's grace that gets us through things. And he talks about the grace of God through the people of God. Those folks who called, those folks who came by, those folks who showed up with a meal. We as a church are called to be there for one another, to be interdependent upon each other. Not independent, not codependent, but interdependent, leaning upon one another in our toughest times. Because ultimately we come together to worship, to confess that we are totally dependent upon the grace of God. If you think you know it all, if you think you got it all together, be careful. For pride comes before a fall. When we go through those difficult times, when we fall into those pits, some of our own making, we have to look up for God. We have to ask for God's grace that can be with us. You see, difficult times remind us that we are not in this alone, but that we all need help. David talks about being stuck in the mud and mire in a pit in darkness. In this season of Epiphany, we come to look for light in our darkest days, light of God's grace. The first time I went to Israel, I was really looking forward to going to the Dead Sea because I heard that if you go to the Dead Sea, that you can't sink. It's got so much salt. It's so salty that you just float. You don't even need to know how to swim. And I thought, this will be great. And I went out to that beach and I looked out at this beautiful sea. and I started walking out to get in it, and I sunk up to my knees. No one told me that the Dead Sea is also muddy, that those minerals that you get out of the Dead Sea will sink and you can go down. And I was stuck in that muck and that mire, and I thought, well, I'm not going to float in this sea if I'm stuck here on the shore. But I had a friend, and together we were able to pull one another out and get out and float in the Dead Sea. Muck and mire, they suck us down. Did you know that submariners actually talk about that? They have this term called mud suction. When a submarine needs to go to the bottom and rest on the bottom, they don't want to find a muddy place. They want to find a sandy place, because if they actually put the submarine down into the mud, it can trap them forever. It takes so much more buoyancy to break loose. Did you know that even when you feel stuck in those miry pits, that God is stronger than any forces in this life that seem to suck us down? David says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he heard my cry. He lifted me up out of the slimy pit in the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. Don't you love that hymn, Love Lifted Me? I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore, very deeply stained with sin, sinking to rise no more. But the master of the sea heard my despairing cry, from the waters lifted me. Now safe am I. And then you know the chorus, love lifted me. Love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me. When we get those times in life when we feel like that we are sinking down, God is present and calls out and lifts us up. Sometimes God does it all at once and everything changes. I found, though, in my times of crisis and my times when I've been down, that God often does it a little bit at a time. It'll be a moment of grace here and a moment of grace there. There's an old saying, no one really knows who first said it. Some people say it was a Hasidic rabbi. But it's this: I walk, I fall, I get up. I walk, I fall, I get up. I walk, I fall, I get up. But all the while, I keep dancing. I love that picture. Though we sometimes stumble through life, there is a tune that calls to us to dance in life. As John Michael Montgomery puts it, life's a dance you learn as you go. But you have to have a tune to which to dance. What is it that is your soundtrack in life? How did David come out of this pit? He began to recall and remember that God had helped him before and that God would help him again. He said, many, my Lord God, are the wonders you have done and the things you have planned for us. None can compare to you. Were I to speak and tell of your deeds, there would be too many to declare. So many times we come to God with our list, our wants, and our desires. Don't you think it might be wise, before we ask God for anything else, that we thank God for what God has already done? That from time to time we make out gratitude lists. David's hymn begins with words of praise. Though he might feel like he was stuck in this pit, what begins to bring him out is when he turns his attention and begins to praise God for what God has done. Malik Kalin is a journalist for the Wall Street Journal. He was born in Turkey, but he was raised in England in a boarding school. And there in that boarding school, they had to go to chapel. And they taught them hymns of faith. When Christmas time came, they taught Christmas carols. Malik grew up and he left all that behind. As a young man, he was back in Turkey visiting. He was in a terrible automobile accident. He had a number of broken ribs. Some of his vital organs were damaged. He was struggling to breathe. He was delirious with fever. He was in and out of a comatose state. But when he would come to a little bit, the nurses told him later on that he would sing Christmas carols. One time he kind of came to and he looked at a guy on his right and a guy on his left, and they had bandages on their head, and he started singing We Three Kings. He sang Away in the Manger. He sang Silent Night. When he got better and they told him about this, he remembered a little bit about those. Malik talked about how those Christmas carols that he thought he had forgotten long ago somehow took him back to his childhood, somehow took him back past the pain he was in and began to purge his thoughts and allow him to focus on something more than where he was. They transported him to a new place, and he said they allowed him the space for patience while God healed his body. What are the songs that call to you in life? You see, David talks about this miry muck that we get into from time to time. But the way he gets out of it is he changes the song. He changes the score. He changes the music that he's listening to. He says, he put a new song in my mouth, a praise to God. That song, MacArthur's Park, is depressing to me. All that sweet green icing flowing down. And someone left the cake out in the rain, and it took too long to take it. I'll never be able to bake it because I'll never have that recipe again. Some of y'all like disco. That song just kind of brings me down, but at the same time, the song's upbeat. It's a bit confusing. A guy named Jimmy Webb wrote that song, not our Jimmy Webb, a different one. And in the original version, not the one they sang later on, but in the original one, there's also a line that says, there will be another song for me, for I will sing it. There will be another dream for me. Someone will bring it. Even in the midst of a song of heartbreak, there can be changes and shift. My friend Chris was listening to that song about being better off in a pine box on a slow train bound for Georgia. I said, Chris, you have another CD? He said, no, that's the one I'm playing. I said, well, let's just turn it off for a minute. And then we turned on some lights, and he set down the drink. He put out the cigar, and we began to talk about life and about where he was, but also about where he was going. Chris was in our choir. I said, Chris, is there any other song that comes to your mind in the midst of this downtime? He said, yeah, there's an old tune that's running through my head. Something that keeps coming to me off and on when I let it in. And I said, why don't we sing it? And he began to sing, the soul that on Jesus hath leaned for repose. I will not desert to his foes. That soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, I'll never, no never, no never forsake. How firm a foundation, ye saints of the Lord. Chris slowly began to shift his mind from the depression that he was spiraling down and began to think about the God who was with him. Later on, he and Mary got back together. I got a Christmas card from them not too long ago. I did their wedding about a year after that time. He came back to life. He found love again, but only after he found the love of God afresh and anew. There is light, there is music for even the darkest of our days.